One of my lines is, I always say I've been yelled at by the best of them. I would tell you that taking over the responsibility of a heart valve being on the shelf is no joke. And if you're what may have been a back of house support organization, and now you're coming in a large way behind the red line, you've got to have that awareness of what you're doing.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
This week on Power Supply, we speak with Daniel Pfister, president and consultant at United Pathways Incorporated. Dan has 14 years of foundational experiences across multiple hospitals and was employed in various patient support service roles within central distribution, materials management, emergency department, pharmacy, sterile processing, case carts, and as a surgery coordinator. He has 15 years delivering solution consulting for a large healthcare manufacturing company, implementing process improvement projects in hundreds of hospitals across the United States. Now, as an independent consultant focusing on improving the gaps in work streams, transforming executive strategy into actionable results, and advocating for a patient-centric supply chain. So, Hayes, I got introduced to Dan through a mutual colleague who actually hosts the First Case podcast, Paul Wafer. And one of the things that Paul told me was that Dan does a really excellent job of connecting with clinicians to help make change management projects and supply chains successful. So I'm really excited to talk to him today.
Yeah, I'm excited for everybody to hear our interview with Dan. He has just some really unique perspectives. He's obviously been in large, sophisticated health system. He's been on the manufacturing side. So come on, listen to this. You're going to learn a whole bunch about change management, consolidated workforces. So we're excited to have him.
All right, we'll be right back after a short break with Daniel Pfister, president and consultant at United Pathways Incorporated.
From 17 Studios, you're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now is Daniel Pfister, president and consultant at United Pathways Incorporated. And today we're going to be talking about change management. And this is such a critical skill for supply chain, but we're going to go even deeper than that. And we're going to talk about listening to your internal customer for successful change management. So, Dan, thanks so much. I know we had a chance to talk before we had you on the show. You got great things to say, and I'm looking forward to this interview today. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, and I hope I have great things to say, but we'll see what happens.
Well, why don't we start by having you tell us a little bit about your background. We always read the bio before we get started, but maybe just tell us where you found your calling as it relates to supply chain and all the other departments that you've supported over the years.
Well, I guess I started in healthcare when I was young, really as just an entry-level job. And for about 15 years, I worked in multiple hospitals in various support roles. Again, from just getting my feet wet in housekeeping and central supply, sterile supply. I was an emergency room technician. I was a pharmacy IV tech. I got into surgical supply, inventory coordinator, business manager. And I would say foundationally, that beginning showed me that hospitals are a very unique business, and things happen in there that are unlike most organizations or most businesses that people go to every day. And then for about another 15 years, I worked for a major medical manufacturer providing solution support and consulting and process improvement in hundreds of hospitals across the United States and a few out of the country. And then what happens is you get to a certain time in your life and age when you think you'd like to see what you could do on your own and what changes you can make into the industry. You kind of step off a cliff and see what can come your way. So I've been offering consulting services now for about 6 years.
Excellent. And I could tell you, as you talk about jumping off that cliff, every single one of us on the show today has taken that leap ourselves. And it is a leap, and there could be a good deal of trepidation, but I always find everybody says that it's pretty rewarding once you make that decision. And one of the things I really like about your background is you've really seen it from a lot of different perspectives. And so when we put that in the context of change management, I think empathy is a pretty critical skill. And we'll dive into that some more for sure. But also knowing the different departments where that change is going to be implemented, having a diverse background is also critical. So I'm going to emphasize that as one of the reasons that we brought you on the show today, and also one of the reasons that you have this skill set. And before we talk about some recent success that you had with the Cleveland Clinic, I just thought maybe we just talk about what change management is and what does it mean to you when somebody says change management?
Well, I think that's a real buzzword in the industry. And you can kind of hang your shingle out on that. I'm an expert in change management. Hire me, I'll make your life better. And I use it myself, frankly, to communicate what I might offer to clients. But really, if you just boil it down, managing change is really about relationships, culture, and follow through. I mean, a project is a project, and it's always going to have effects on staff, no matter what you're doing. And so what you actually have to do is understand what those effects mean and how they are literally affecting human beings and individuals that before you walked into the room, they've been coming and doing the same thing for a long period of time, and now you're changing it. And so what you've got to do foundationally is be aware of what that means. And you have to roll up the sleeves, and you have to listen, and you have to be very empathetic, and you have to know that you are the change. You're representing the potential disaster that you're bringing into this group, and you've got to own it end to end.
It's almost like you want to call it impact management, because if you're in there and you're doing the project, there's a good chance you're moving forward with it. So it's not really about whether or not to change. You're managing the perception and the reality of the impact of whatever's changing. That's interesting. Let's talk about background and overview of this recent success that you had with the Cleveland Clinic. What is the project? Why were you engaged for the project? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, I just want to say I had a great opportunity to work for the Cleveland Clinic for an extended period of time, and I'm very grateful to them for that opportunity. But just to keep it really high level in this regard to this conversation, I did some work to support their efforts to build an enterprise-wide inventory management team that would bring supply chain technology and logistics expertise to the surgical and procedural areas. And the foundational change within that initiative was shifting the ownership of what is historically nurse-managed supplies to this new consolidated supply chain team. Historically, supply chain management behind the red lines has either been totally nurse managed or a mix of personnel. You might have an inventory coordinator that reports to surgery. They may report to materials management. You may have a business manager that takes a look at some of the high dollar implants and medical devices that have to be brought in and rental equipment. And it could be a complete mix of different people. It may not be just one organization. And so when you're going in there to pull all that together into a new organization, you're changing legacy standards and you're driving considerable change to very tenured people.
Dan, I love this scenario that you just talked about behind the red line. One of the key things that you talked about early on was really building those relationships. This success cannot be done without those relationships. Where do you start when you're changing a concept that's been done for years, maybe decades? This is the way we've always handled it. Where do you start? Do you start at the C-suite, or is it engaging at the nurse level? Where did you start pulling this all together to get the buy-in that everybody would move forward?
Thanks, Gary. I think there's two aspects to that question. which first of all is how do I even get in the building in the first place? And that is, you get invited by an executive who has a vision and a strategy about what they're trying to do in their organization. Or maybe there's a huge problem that needs to be solved and they just need some outside help to get that off the ground. So that gets you into the project. But to your larger point is, okay, so now you're in, you've got executive sponsorship, somebody with a title after their name has brought you in, so you've got that hall pass to go around. But now you actually have to deal with people on the ground. And that's a completely different environment because the people on the ground don't care who invited you in. What they care about is you're about to change their environment and you're telling them it's going to be for the better. But they've been down that road before. They've heard that story before, and it never got better before. And now you're just another person coming in and saying that. And that's where some of my background helps with that. So I worked for many years on the hospital side in operating rooms. And one of my lines is I always say I've been yelled at by the best of them. I would tell you that taking over the responsibility of a heart valve being on the shelf is no joke. And if you're what may have been a back of house support organization, and now you're coming in a large way behind the red line, you've got to have that awareness of what you're doing.
All right, Dan. So can you give me an example of what you're talking about just to help color in the picture a little bit?
Sure. So one aspect of the initiative, I had to speak to a surgery department at a morning report regarding the process improvement project that I was working on. And it was like 6:30, 7 a.m. And I started talking about how great this initiative was going to be and, all the change that we were going to bring and how all the nurses prior used to have to, be involved with inventory management and worry about all of that and be concerned about expiry and product on the shelf and does Dr. So-and-so going to have his product? And as I was going through my little soapbox speech, I started looking at their faces, and again, it was about 50 nurses that are coming to work in the morning. They've got their coffee. They're looking at what procedures they're going to have to do, and there's some guy talking to them about all the stuff that foundationally they really don't care about. And so I just stopped and I said, "Listen, I'm Dan Pfister, and you're going to hate everything about this, but in the end, it will be better. And if it's not, I'm the person to blame." And all of a sudden the mood was lifted. Nurses are great. Like they'll give it right back to you. And people are saying, yeah, you're right. We're going to blame you and all that kind of stuff. And all of a sudden now you've got a relationship. Everyone's joking with each other. But what we were going to do though, is there were certain people there were nurses that had to check the Synthes cabinet. There were nurses that had to make sure that the cardiac implants were on the shelf. And we were going to take that away from them. And the inventory coordinators that previously had reported to that surgery department, they were now going to report to the corporate supply chain organization and be part of a consolidated workforce. And all of that was going to be a large amount of change that we had to manage, but not manage it from like what would be a traditional project perspective. And those are the things that you're metriced on. But from a relationship and cultural perspective, that was job one.
So you just used that term consolidated workforce. Can you give us an example of a consolidated workforce so that we understand that concept well?
Yeah, I think it's easier maybe to compare and contrast because the idea of a consolidated workforce like at a Walmart or a Target or an Amazon or things like that is not an innovative concept. Everyone has a common purpose, a common goal. They all report up through clear structures. But if you look at healthcare, especially take an operating room, you will have sterile supply. They may report to the surgery department. Sometimes they might report to the materials department. You'll have an inventory coordinator in the surgery department that reports to the director of surgery. Sometimes it reports to supply chain. Sometimes they're part of central supply, which may or may not be part of supply chain. And then when you get into some of the other procedural areas, you'll have nurses that are managing the stents and the implants in IR and cath lab. They definitely don't report to supply chain, but they have to know all about POs and back orders and all that type of thing. And so you've got these roles and responsibilities that are diverse across various individuals, and you don't have a larger structure. So the larger health systems that are very strategic and innovative have understood the need to create end-to-end structures from strategic sourcing all the way through to operations with really good clinical participation, both from local nurses and from surgeons and physicians. But the changes in revenue reimbursement over the years has made it challenging to drive that through and to be that strategic supply chain consolidated organization. And I'm actually going to have a video coming out of this soon. But when you're predominantly the cost of doing business or a drain on the organization, it can be hard to drive innovation and strategy and to pull together an entire end-to-end structure that is largely based on process improvement and making things better at the patient care event without a lot of financial drivers behind it is very challenging. So you have to advocate for consolidation. You have to advocate for quality, for enhanced safety, for enhanced process improvement in order to drive that through your healthcare system.
That's really interesting. That whole end-to-end concept just keeps coming up in the early episodes of Power Supply. And we recently spoke to Kelly McCrory, and she was talking about getting that integrated, which I think is running parallel to what you're describing to us, but that integrated supply chain. And specifically, we were talking to her about the revenue cycle and connecting that piece. But one thing I want to make sure she did a good job of outlining what the benefits would be and what a gigantic opportunity that is. But I want to, maybe you can clarify if integrated supply chain concepts run parallel to consolidated workforce. And then what are the benefits? You know, you said you went and got in front of the nurses and said, I'm going to do this and you're going to yell at me and you lighten the mood. And then ultimately, you know, I know you're going to go back and say, this is how your lives are going to be better. So anybody that's listening to this who doesn't have a consolidated workforce, or maybe who doesn't even fully understand it, what would be the benefits to that? So I realize that's a two-part question, but how does that relate to integrated? And then what are the benefits of a consolidated workforce?
Okay, well, there's a lot there to unpack, and some of it's vocabulary. And I think for the purpose of this podcast, I'll try to keep it at a high level. But one of the buzzwords I use is a patient-centric supply chain. And it's definitely integrated. It's definitely consolidated. But again, conceptually, like, what does that mean? And if you think about, in order to take care of a patient, you need a thing, whether it's a bedpan or a heart valve, but you need some kind of thing to take care of a patient. And the things are provided by supply chain and support service organizations. But a lot of those organizations are disparate. They're not always integrated. They're not always consolidated. And then you mentioned revenue cycle. The other challenge is a lot of those things are non-reimbursable. You could charge for them from a cost accounting perspective, but you won't be reimbursed for them. So again, a lot of times supply chain can be a cost of doing business, but it's not driving revenue like it used to do 20, 30 years ago, right? And so how do you get into the driver's seat in an organization when you're a financial drain on the organization and the level of expertise and skill that your team needs to be a partner to the clinical side has to be elevated with training and skill sets and creativity and innovation and bringing in people, process, and technology. So it's a big package that you have to bring. But if you look at it, all the problems in healthcare are because of the gaps in between systems and handoffs. So the fact that things are disparate is where all the problems are. You go to the shelf to find a product and it isn't there. Well, the reason why it isn't there could be enormous, right? A global supply chain, somebody called in sick, the par level was wrong, you had a spike in procedures. It could be 50 different things. So who owns it? Who solves it? What kind of analytics can you put behind it? What type of service can you deliver? And all of it has to be aligned to the patient event. And so to try and wrap all that up, you've got to work closely with the clinical side of the house, the operational side of the house, and the financial side of the house to create that integrated, consolidated, end-to-end structure that is primarily patient care focused.
Dan, I love you saying that, patient care focused, patient-centric. It's the mission. That's what drives the ROI. I really, truly believe that. I'm glad you brought it up. One of the things that I was going to ask you, you talk about this change management, you talk about speaking to the nurses, and you roll really new positions under supply chain. Are you finding that labor force, that pool, as you're building it, to build that trust, you're maybe pulling over some of those clinicians, maybe a CNA, maybe a nurse, maybe an LPN. Are you bringing over some of that clinical experience now into supply chain where it's really a different subset of qualifications? Are you seeing that?
So I have seen it in many organizations, and there are supply chain organizations around the country that have nurses on their team. There are supply chain organizations that'll have medical officers on their team working for supply chain. And so I definitely have seen that move of the clinicians into the supply chain world to help with that. And plus, many strategic sourcing organizations will have ongoing meetings with clinicians to look at product conversions and alternatives to items and implants. So yes, the industry is moving closer, definitely. But to get maybe down the level, to get a little into the weeds a little bit, let's take a look at something as critical as preference cards. Okay, so you look at a preference card in an operating room, and again, one of the lines I use to describe it is a preference card has two functions. It's a novel and it's a shopping list. And the novel says Dr. Jones likes the room to be 60 degrees. He likes rock and roll. He likes to talk to the patient before they go in under anesthesia. And the shopping list is he likes Vicryl and a P1 needle. He likes this Runger or whatever. The clinicians are right now in most health systems 100% responsible both for writing the novel and managing the shopping list. And it's one of the reasons why the case cart systems in hospitals have a lot of the problems that they do. And I saw one of the podcasts that you guys did recently on stealing from case carts. And if you think, like, why do some of these things happen, right? And it's because there are foundational effects of the shopping list that maybe should be better managed by a logistics organization than a clinical organization. So now you start looking into a completely different way of looking at what is foundationally seen as a 100% clinical event. Okay. And the preference card represents the surgery. So in effect, it is the surgery. And it's like, well, what are you as a supply chain person doing within my box? What do you know about surgery? And the answer might be nothing. I don't know anything about it. That's why you write the novel. But I can bring expertise to look at the shopping list, and I can help you to streamline the tool down so that it's efficient, so that the back end, all the way down to manufacturers and the supply chain, can be more efficient. Long answer to your question, and sorry to get down too much into detail, but the point is that a supply chain organization needs to move closer to the patient event to see what it can do to improve the experience, both for the patient, the surgeon, and the nurse. Okay, they don't have to be the experts in the surgical aspect of it, but they can look at the pattern recognition of the things that happen within the event and bring expertise to it to improve it all the way up and downstream.
That's fantastic. And you referenced a podcast from one of our sister podcasts on First Case that was about pilfering, which there's a lot of crossover from the various podcasts that we do, is so much so that Gary is going to be a guest to talk about this whole conversation about getting clinicians and getting supply chain sort of on the same page in that traditional cultural battle for control, which you didn't dive right in and outline it, but you did describe it. And that's why we've seen clinicians move into supply chain positions. I think it's to, help get adoption and engagement. And you obviously, just some of the things that you have already said about how you talk to the end users to sort of break down those barriers and start opening up, the possibility of change. And even though everybody knows it's going to be painful, at least everybody can have a sense of humor about it instead of feeling like it's being forced on them, that they're allowed to have an experience through the change process. But I really want to dive in on getting engagement? Because I feel like when you and I were just chatting before we led up to this podcast, that this was an area I felt like you really had a lot of strengths on. And so what do you think are some keys to really, other than, getting the opening right with the audience, what are some other keys to getting that engagement?
So I think really you have to have credibility with your customer. And like I said, if you think about nurses that, and this will be a horrible statement and perhaps controversial, but basically, like, nurses have been lied to by everybody who's walked into the department and promised something. And their experience is often colored by that and saying, here's another person that's coming in to say that my life is going to be better. But at the end of the day, I know I have to put out every fire that's going to go on around me. And I think you have to be very aware of that cultural concern that nurses have is real. It's not coming from nowhere. It's coming from experience. And so the first thing you have to do is you have to acknowledge where your customer is and what their concerns are. And then you've got to promise that you're going to make it better. And by God, you've got to deliver. You've just got to deliver. And then on a practical level, I've had experiences where I've had a process improvement committee to drive something through that was, in an operating room with a bunch of nurses. And for the first month, no one would show up. I'd be there, with a couple, of my workers, and there'd be no one else. They just wouldn't come. And everyone's busy or something has come up. You've just got to work it, and you've got to get them. You've got to win them over. That's the only way I can say it. If I could just real quickly, I would say, like, as a consultant too, you have to be very careful how you enter these spaces. And a lot of consultants come in like with, really cool questionnaires and a data collection tool. And I should have one too. And I should brand it and give it a really cool name. But I always say that the best consulting tool ever invented is a blank piece of paper. And you should walk in and you should talk to people and you should listen. And you don't leave until you understand what they're going through as well as they do.
Hey, Dan, I have one quick question to follow up on that exact point. Obviously, you're talking about you're an outside consultant coming into a hospital system to helping with their change management. In some cases, we have providers that are listening to us right now who don't have maybe the means to hire somebody like yourself. How difficult is it to actually have change management and do it internally by yourself with your own current staff? And if so, how maybe some tips and tricks for them to think about?
Well, I always like to say I work for pizza, but, it's got to be a large pizza. A lot of organizations are trying to build what are essentially internal consulting organizations. And again, it's like, it's the people are there. You'll hear this a lot from nurses and from people who work in hospitals. Again, as a consultant, whenever you walk in, people will immediately go, oh my God, another consultant who are going to listen to all my best ideas and make it their own. And again, it's a very common experience that hospital people have had. And I was a hospital person for 15 years. And I had the exact same opinion of consultants, and now I am one. What I try to do is for organizations that maybe can't just bring in a big box consulting house for a couple of years to, make everything better, is to try and look at the team that they do have and to foster an environment of innovation and transformation, and to encourage the people that they have to speak up, to bring ideas, even if they're crazy ideas, to their leadership and say, hey, what if we tried this? And what if we did that? And because a lot of the best ideas are in the people who are coming to work every day and dealing with all of the fires and seeing everything, but they're just not in an opportunity or a position where they can drive change through. So I would say, again, it's up to leadership, is to look at the skill sets of the people that they actually already have. Maybe they need a little help from an outside person just to frame the need, just to help them articulate what they're trying to drive within their group, in their team. But you can foster it internally. You can grow your people. You can develop your people. You just have to encourage innovation, transformation, courage, frankly, and creativity.
All right, Dan. So when we're talking about that leader who's going to take the ball and run with it, real definitively, what kind of skills do they need? What are the soft skills? What are the hard skills? What's the makeup here?
Well, again, it does start with a leader, right? And that leader is going to be challenged because they have to sell up and they have to sell down. And so, first of all, they have to sell up to executive management to say, I want to transform whatever it is. I want to change the organization. And then they have to sell it down through the organization, and they have to sell it to their own team. And so they have to go to their team who maybe have just been coming in for years and punching in and punching out and doing the same thing they always did. And now they have to explain to them that things are going to be different. And that is simply a sales job. It is a cultural change, and you have to win people over by the argument. And again, it's really easy, maybe easier than in other industries in healthcare, because it's patient focused. And so you can always get it down to the effect that your team is going to have on somebody's mom, somebody's dad, someone's child, if they can drive this change and create this organization differently. So first of all, you've got to have vision and you've got to have mission, right? Okay, now to get a bit more tactical, depending on what you're doing, you might need a new technology. Or you may need to have the technology that you already own. You may need to expand it into a new department. So you're going to need those hard skills about that technology. Or if you're buying something from the market, then you're going to need that vendor organization to support the implementation of that technology. And you need to make sure that they understand the customer environment that they're walking into as well, so that they carry your vision and mission to the frontline customer. And then in terms of soft skills, again, it can be relationship, it can be communication skills, it can be like having classes with people that simply open up their awareness. I mean, I'll jump to a very high level. One time I walked a CFO into an operating room and he had not been in there in years. And it was eye-opening for him. So things like that is just making people walk the environment and just to get exposed to something that they just may not have looked at. And then again, in terms of a supply chain team, the workers, let them understand what nurses are going through. Maybe they need to observe some surgeries. Maybe they need to help with case pick. Maybe they need to run supplies around during an operation so that they can feel the stress that the staff feels. Whatever it is to get them exposed to this new environment so that literally their DNA is affected by it. And then on the outside of it, it is the tools, the techniques, the technology, the devices, the vendor solutions. Those are the things that you implement in a traditional project management perspective.
Dan, I just got a comment on what you brought up. I think it's a really good point you brought up. Is you said the CFO saw a case. I think that all supply chain individuals should have to walk into those shoes and just shadow a case if they feel comfortable to do that, because it really, really demonstrates the mission and the focus of the patient. And you brought it up, and I think it's just part of that training and part of that growth that it makes them aware of what's truly happening and what they're affecting, and is ultimately a patient. I really like your comments, so thank you, Dan.
Yeah, I'll just kind of put a cap on it just to say one of the things I try to do is if I walk into a procedural or surgical environment, I try to have scrubs on. And it's a simple thing, but you walk in as a suit and a tie, you're seen in a certain way. You walk in scrubs, and if you know your way around the department, you're embraced in a different way. And so again, I would say like it's almost a soft skill is you need to understand your customer. You just need to walk in their shoes.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job, too, throughout this interview. And you said it at the beginning, but really what Gary was giving you a lot of credit for was that patient and being patient-centric, but aligning those patients' needs with what the clinicians are feeling and living every day, and then marrying that with whatever that strategic sourcing initiative is. And that may not be happening everywhere around the country. And yet I'm going to ask you this last question anyway and say, let's say that alignment is in place. There's always room for improvement. So what is the future? How do you think we can, even if they get alignment, how can they build on that? How can they do it better? Where does this thing need to go?
And again, I want to give credit to the major health systems that are out ahead of a lot of this, looking at outcome management, looking at pattern recognition, trying to align teams, resources, and spend to the patient event. on a practical level, I mentioned it earlier, but I do think that supply chain needs to move behind the red lines more and get closer to the patient experience. In terms of an operating room, I advocate for supply chain taking over preference cards and case pick and aligning themselves with nurses so that nurses really can focus on patient care and they're not just having to deal with the office work that ties everybody up. And that way they can stay ahead with it. And then in some of the procedural areas is bringing the vendor solutions that are on the market for inventory management and expiry management and running those and getting closer to the actual demand patterns that occur. So I think it's as simple as just getting very, very close to that patient experience and understanding what's going on, knowing what a lap chole is, knowing what this procedure is, knowing what the impact, the demand pull on the supplies are, understanding what the supplies do, understanding the critical nature of the supplies, and then designing a supply chain that is responsive to that demand signal, that is very light touch and moves rapidly in order to fill that demand. Kind of a broad answer, but that's how I would look at it. I think the future is that the operational structure of healthcare needs to become much more closer to the clinical event.
It's so interesting because you see these vendor companies that have training programs for vendors that are coming in to really make sure that they understand what goes on in a procedure to prepare them for possibly being involved in procedures. And there's even colleges out there that people go to just so that they can get those jobs in the vendor community. It's almost like we should apply that to supply chain orientation and training as well in a very similar manner. And I think it would help them get that close. But Dan, you did a phenomenal job. Really enjoyed this interview. You gave us a lot to think about. This was a very quick interview. I think it went by very fast because there was just so much substance. So I want to thank you for coming on and sharing your insight today.
No, well, thank you for inviting me. I'll always take an opportunity to get up on my soapbox. The problem is getting me off. So, so thanks very much. I appreciate it.
That was Daniel Pfister, president and consultant at United Pathways Incorporated, talking about change management. And I know there was a couple of points in there, Gary, where we started to dive really deep into the weeds. And there was probably 3 potential podcasts in this one podcast. But I will say, Dan did such a nice job of staying high level, but putting a lot of content and ideas. And I know you anchored on the patient-centric, so I'm not going to steal that from you on this summer, this outro. But I do want to say that it is all about relationship building. And I can see where his vision for the future, we got to be more shoulder to shoulder from clinician and supply chain to be able to establish relationships. Because if we're siloed and we're not taking ownership over the things that we're good at, and the clinicians are taking ownership of the things that they're good at, and we're not doing it side by side, it's going to be really hard to have this integration and consolidation that he was talking about.
So agreed, Justin, and good points. One of the key things that I liked that he discussed was knowing his end user, knowing his customer, walking into the OR in scrubs, pulling the nurses together in a meeting and saying, this leveling the playing field and trying to be a partner and really understanding. His comment that he brought a CFO into a case to see what it truly looked like in a case. I mean, how many times has that been done? I mean, your focus is truly about the patient, Justin. You brought it up again, and I will always talk mission. But change management is such a buzzword that he brings up. But like you said, the relationships to earn the trust, the changing of supply chain and really being a true clinician, and that culture and the follow through, he's got it. I'm really excited about what he shared today. So appreciate all his comments.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Power Supply by subscribing on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast application. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And on behalf of Hayes, Gary, and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply.